She was 65 years old when the mill owner she had served for 31 years called her into his office and told her, without quite meeting her eyes, that the new machines did not need a woman who understood grain the old way. Her name was Prudence Calloway, and the man who dismissed her was Nathaniel Osgood, the son of the miller who had first hired her as a girl and who had, in the years since inheriting his father's business, come to see her long experience less as an asset than an inconvenience. She left his office that afternoon with a small pay envelope, a shawl, and exactly $1 to her name after settling her last debts in town. So when she heard that the county was finally auctioning off the collapsed old grist mill on Cutter's Creek, abandoned for 19 years since its roof caved in during a spring flood, she walked to the courthouse steps and offered the $1 in her pocket, certain no one else wanted a ruin of rotted beams and a broken wheel. The clerk very nearly refused to accept so small a sum as a legitimate bid, but sealed within the collapsed stones of that forgotten mill was something that would not only restore to Prudence everything a lifetime of labor should have earned her, but would give back to an entire valley of truth it had waited 2 decades to hear. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Prudence Calloway. If you have ever been told, after a lifetime of good work, that you are no longer wanted, tell us in the comments. We would be glad to know you are not alone in that particular grief. Prudence Calloway was born in 1830 in a narrow river valley in western Pennsylvania, in a settlement so small it shared its grist mill with 3 neighboring hollows. And it was that mill and the man who ran it who shaped the whole of her early life. Her father, Josiah Calloway, was not the mill's owner but its miller, a man hired to run the great stones and keep the wheel turning for an owner who lived comfortably elsewhere and rarely visited. Josiah had a gift, rare even among men who spent their lives around grain, for reading a kernel by touch and sound alone, for knowing from the particular hiss of the millstones whether the grind was running too fine or too coarse, for sensing in his bones when the water level on the creek was about to shift and the wheels pace with it. He raised Prudence, his only surviving child after 2 infant sons had been lost to fever, not as a daughter to be sheltered from his trade, but as an apprentice to be trained in it. And by the time she was 12 years old, she could set a pair of millstones with precision that impressed men 3 times her age. It was not, in that place and time, considered proper for a girl to spend her days dusted white with flour and grain chaff, and there were those in the valley who whispered that Josiah Calloway did his daughter a disservice by raising her to a trade she could never openly practice. But Josiah told her, in words she carried with her for the rest of her life, that a mill was the truest kind of machine there was, because it took something the world called common and made it into something the world could not live without, and that anyone who understood how to do that with grain understood something true about people as well. He taught her that the millstones themselves were nothing without the furrows cut carefully into their faces, channels that looked, to an untrained eye, like scars or flaws, but which were in fact the very thing that let the stones do their work, guiding the ground meal outward instead of trapping it uselessly in the center. A mill without its furrows, he said, was just 2 heavy rocks. A mill with them was a thing that fed a valley. Prudence married at 19, a good and steady man named Amos Fenwick, a carpenter by trade who had come through the valley building barns and stayed on when he fell in love with a miller's clever daughter. They had, in time, 2 daughters of their own, though both would grow up and move to Ohio with husbands of their own long before the events of this story, leaving their mother's later years quieter than she might have wished. Amos died of lung ailment in 1861, not yet 50, leaving Prudence a widow at 31 with a small house, a small garden, and a knowledge of milling that, by circumstance more than plan, would become her livelihood after all. The mill in that valley had passed by then into hands of an aging owner named Silas Osgood, a decent if unimaginative man who, finding himself short-handed after his long-time miller retired, offered Prudence a position on the frank admission that no one else in the valley understood the stones half so well as Josiah Calloway's daughter. It was, for its time, an unusual arrangement, and there were mutterings about it in the valley for a season or 2, but Prudence Calloway ran that mill honestly and well for the better part of 3 decades, through Silas Osgood's ownership and, after his death in 1884, through the ownership of his son Nathaniel, who inherited the mill along with his father's respect for Prudence's skill, though not, as it would turn out, his father's sense of obligation toward her. The valley Prudence served, known locally as Cutter's Hollow after the creek that ran through it, was a modest farming community that depended on that single working grist mill the way a body depends on a heart it rarely thinks about until it stops. Farmers brought their wheat and corn from 3 hollows over, and the quality of Cutter's Hollow's flour had, under Prudence's steady hand, become something of a quiet local pride, sold as far as the county seat and beyond. She took particular satisfaction, in those years, in training up 2 of the valley's younger men in the trade, believing as her father had that milling was too important a skill to let die with any one person. And it was one of these young men's own bitter jealousy, unresolved and unspoken across years, that would eventually play a role in the trouble to come. But we are getting ahead of the story. For 3 decades, Prudence Calloway was simply the valley's miller, respected if unconventional, steady where much else in a farming community could be uncertain, and it was this steadiness, this decades-long faithfulness to a single trade and a single community, that made what happened to her in the autumn of 1895 all the more bitter betrayal. Nathaniel Osgood had never been an unkind man exactly, but he was an anxious one, prone to worrying over the mill's finances in ways his more settled father never had. And when a traveling salesman came through Cutter's Hollow that autumn promoting a new roller milling system that promised faster, cheaper flour production than the old millstones could manage, Nathaniel became convinced almost overnight that modernization was the only thing standing between his mill and ruin. The new machinery, he was told, required different skills than the old stone grinding methods, skills a younger operator could learn faster and for less wage than a woman of 65 who had spent her whole life mastering a trade the salesman assured him was already obsolete. Nathaniel called Prudence into the small office at the front of the mill on a gray October afternoon and told her, with a particular discomfort a man who knows he is doing wrong but has already decided to do it anyway, that he would be installing the new rollers by spring, and that he did not believe her decades of experience with millstones would transfer usefully to the new equipment. He offered her, by way of severance, 1 month's wage, and the suggestion, delivered without apparent irony, that a woman of her age might find the rest easier than continued labor. Prudence did not argue. She had learned, across a long life, that argue with a man who has already made up his mind is generally a waste of breath better spent elsewhere. She walked home that afternoon along the creek she had listened to for 30 years, settled what small debts remained to the general store and the widow who did her mending, and found, when she counted what remained, that she possessed exactly $1. Her daughters in Ohio wrote back, within weeks offering to take her in. But Prudence, who had spent her whole life being useful, could not make herself accept a future of simply being cared for, not while there was still breath in her and work she believed she could still do. It was in this state of mind, $1 in her pocket and a lifetime of milling knowledge with nowhere left to spend it, that Prudence heard the county courthouse in the seat town was finally disposing an old abandoned gristmill on Cutter's Creek, some 6 miles upstream from the mill she had just lost. A mill that had stood roofless and half-collapsed since a violent spring flood in 1876 tore through its foundation and drowned its old miller, a reclusive man named Ezekiel Marsh who had run the mill alone and left, so far as anyone in the county knew, no family and no records worth preserving. The county had held the abandoned property in a kind of legal limbo for 19 years, unable to locate an heir and unwilling to spend money, clearing a ruin no one wanted, until a new county clerk, eager to clean up old, unresolved parcels, finally scheduled it for public auction on the courthouse steps that November. Prudence walked the 6 miles to the county seat on the appointed morning, arriving to find a small, unenthusiastic gathering of perhaps a dozen men, none of whom seemed to want the property so much as they wanted to see what foolish price it might sell for. The clerk read out a description of the parcel, a collapsed mill structure and its surrounding acre of overgrown creekside land, sold as is with no guarantee of clear title beyond the county's own claim. And when he called for opening bids, the gathered men laughed and shuffled and offered nothing at all, several of them remarking loudly that they wouldn't pay $1 to haul the rotted timbers away, let alone to own them. It was in the small, uncomfortable silence that followed that Prudence Calloway stepped forward and offered the $1 in her pocket, and the clerk, more out of desire to close the file than any belief in the wisdom of the sale, accepted it, writing her out a deed to a ruin that every other person present considered worthless beyond the value of its scrap lumber. The old mill, when Prudence walked the 6 miles back out to see it properly, was a sorrier sight even than she had braced herself for. The roof had collapsed entirely along its northern half, leaving splintered rafters open to 19 years of weather, and the great wooden wheel that had once turned in Cutter's Creek hung half-torn from its axle, green with rot and river moss. But it was the mill's stonework, not its ruined timber, that Prudence found herself drawn to as she picked her way carefully through the wreckage that first afternoon. And it was there, in the mill's lower level where the great grinding stones themselves still sat undisturbed beneath a fallen section of roof, that she made her first discovery. One of the two massive millstones, the runner stone that should have sat squarely atop its stationary partner, had been shifted from its normal resting position, tilted at an angle that no ordinary use or even the flood itself could easily explain, propped as though someone had deliberately levered aside and never properly reset it. Beneath its edge, wedged into a gap between the tilted stone and the millstone foundation, Prudence found a small tin box, rusted nearly through, that had clearly been placed there with purpose rather than left by accident. She carried that tin box home to her small house that evening and worked it open by lamplight with a patience that came naturally to a woman who had spent her whole life coaxing stubborn machinery into cooperation. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow, she found a bundle of papers in a careful, cramped hand, along with a small leather pouch containing not coin, as she had half expected, but a set of surveyor's brass instruments and a folded county map, its creases soft with age. The papers, as Prudence read them deep into that first night, told a story that Cutter's Creek's old records had never properly recorded, and that the valley itself had half forgotten in the 19 years since the mill's collapse and its miller's death. Ezekiel Marsh, it emerged from his own careful, private accounting, had not been merely a reclusive miller but had once, decades earlier, worked as a county surveyor, and it was in that earlier capacity that he had uncovered something which had troubled him enough to abandon surveying altogether and retreat into the isolated life of a mill keeper. In the early 1850s, Marsh had been part of the original survey team that mapped the county's land grants along Cutter's Creek, and his private papers detailed, in increasingly agitated handwriting across several dated entries, his growing certainty that a large and valuable tract of bottomland along the creek, land rich enough to have supported perhaps a dozen additional farming families, had been deliberately mismapped during that original survey to appear as unusable floodplain, when in fact, it sat safely above the flood line and had simply been redirected, through a falsified survey and a quiet private purchase, into the hands of a single wealthy landholder from the county seat, a man Marsh named in his papers as Cornelius Thane. This same Cornelius Thane, Marsh's papers made clear, had been the surveying company's own principal investor, and had used his position to ensure the falsified map, when unquestioned and uncorrected for decades, all while quietly leasing out the disputed bottomland to tenant farmers at rates that made him a comfortable fortune off land the county's own records insisted was worthless swamp. Marsh, unable to prove his suspicions to the satisfaction of a county government that had no appetite for reopening old land grants, and increasingly convinced that pursuing the matter openly would cost him more than his career, had instead spent years quietly gathering evidence, resurveying sections of the disputed land in his own time, using the same brass instruments Prudence now held in her hands, and recording measurements that directly contradicted the official county map. He had, according to his final entries, intended to bring his complete findings before a state land office rather than the county government he no longer trusted, but had died in the 1876 flood before ever making that journey. His evidence sealed beneath his own mill's millstone, apparently as precaution against a fire or theft he feared more than the flood that ultimately took him. Prudence sat with those papers for the better part of a week, turning over in her mind both the weight of what she had found and the practical difficulty of doing anything useful with it. Cornelius Thane himself had died years earlier, but Prudence discovered, through careful and patient inquiry at the county seat, that his estate had passed to his son, Ambrose Thane, who now served as a county commissioner and who had, in that capacity, quietly continued leasing out the same disputed bottomland to tenant farmers, several of whom Prudence came to know personally were struggling badly under lease terms that assumed the land was of poor quality and therefore cheaply valued terms. That made no sense at all if the land was in fact the rich, flood-safe bottomland Ezekiel Marsh's resurveys suggested it truly was. It did not take long for word to reach Ambrose Thane that an elderly former miller had purchased the old Marsh property and was making careful inquiries about decades-old survey records. Thane, a smooth and well-practiced man in county politics, called on Prudence himself within a fortnight, ostensibly to welcome her to her new property, but in truth, as became quickly clear, to feel out how much she knew and whether it could be quietly managed. When Prudence, with the same plain composure that had served her 3 decades at the millstones, told him she had found old survey papers among the mill's effects and intended to have them properly reviewed by the State Land Office, Thane's manner cooled considerably, and he suggested, with a courtesy that did not fully disguise the threat beneath it, that an old woman alone, recently dismissed from her livelihood and living in a collapsed ruin, might find herself in considerable difficulty if she pursued matters that were, in his words, long settled and best left undisturbed. Prudence was not a woman easily frightened by veiled threats from comfortable men, having spent a working lifetime among farmers and mill hands who respected plain speech far more than polished manners. She wrote, within days, to the State Land Office in the capital, enclosing careful copies of Marsh's survey notes and measurements, and she wrote as well to the young man she had once trained at the Osgood Mill, a steady fellow named Peter Ruskin who had left milling some years before to study surveying himself and who, upon reading Marsh's old measurements, confirmed to Prudence that the mathematics were sound and the discrepancy with the official county map was real and substantial. It was Peter Ruskin, in fact, who traveled with Prudence to the state capitol that winter to present the case formally, and whose own credentials as a licensed surveyor lent authority to Prudence's discovery that her own testimony alone might have struggled to command. Ambrose Thane did not surrender his family's decades-old advantage easily. He argued before the county board. When the matter finally came to a hearing that spring, that old private notebooks from a dead recluse proved nothing, that the original survey had been properly conducted and approved by the state at the time, and that reopening land grants 40 years settled would throw the whole county's property records into chaos. But Peter Ruskin's independent resurvey, conducted openly that spring with several county officials present as witnesses, confirmed precisely what Ezekiel Marsh had measured alone decades before. The disputed bottomland sat well above any reasonable floodline, and the original survey marks, when examined closely, showed clear evidence of having been altered after their initial placement. Faced with this new, independently verified evidence, and with several of his own long-suffering tenant farmers now present at the hearing describing years of lease payments made on a false premise of poor, swampy land, the county board voted to reopen the land grant for proper review, a process that would, over the following year, restore fair ownership terms to the dozen or so farming families who had unknowingly been paying inflated rents on land whose true value had been hidden from them for 40 years. Ambrose Thane did not go to prison, for no law had criminalized what his father had done so long ago, but he lost, in a single spring, both the quiet income his family had drawn from the deception for 2 generations and the standing in county politics that income had helped purchase, resigning his commissioner's seat within a year under a cloud of scrutiny he could not outtalk. Prudence Calloway, for her part, sought no personal claim on the disputed bottomland itself, believing it belonged rightfully to the farming families who had worked it. But the State Land Office, in recognition of her role in uncovering 4 decades of hidden fraud, along with a grateful contribution raised among the very tenant farmers whose lease terms were now finally corrected, arranged a settlement that allowed her to properly rebuild the old mill on Cutter's Creek, the very ruin she had purchased for $1, restoring its roof, resetting its great tilted millstone to its proper working position, and rebuilding its rotted wheel so that it once again turned the current it had sat idle in for 19 years. It became, under her steady hand, a working mill once more, serving not only Cutter's Hollow, but the newly restored farms of the disputed bottomland besides, and Prudence, in a final gesture that surprised no one who had known her patient generosity across 3 decades, offered young Peter Ruskin a formal partnership in the mill's operation, ensuring the trade her father had taught her would continue safely into another generation. It is worth returning, before we close, to where this story began. A woman of 65, fired for the crime of growing old in a trade she had mastered, left with $1 and a lifetime of skill the world had just told her no longer mattered. Prudence Calloway never did work again for Nathaniel Osgood, whose new roller milling system, as it happened, struggled for years afterward without the steady, practiced hand that had once kept his father's mill running smoothly, a fact that more than one farmer in the valley noted aloud with dry satisfaction whenever Osgood's flour proved inconsistent. But Prudence did not need Osgood's mill any longer. She had, with her single remaining dollar, bought back the very thing that had been taken from her, not merely a building of stone and timber, but the plain right to keep being useful in the trade her father had raised her to, and in restoring an old mill everyone else called worthless. She had restored, quietly and almost as a matter of course, both her own dignity and an entire hollow of farmers' rightful due. We began this story with an old woman offering her last dollar for a collapsed ruin that a dozen men had refused even to bid on. We ended with a mill turning again in Cutter's Creek. A dozen farming families finally paid fairly for land that had been quietly stolen from them 2 generations before, and a woman who proved, at 65 years old, and with nothing left but her hands and her knowledge, that being told you are no longer needed is not the same thing as it being true. Thank you for spending this time with Prudence's story. If it moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who has ever been told, too soon or too unfairly, that their working years were behind them. We would love to know, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.